What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for UnderRail. Now, just to get a couple things out of the way right at the beginning here, I like to review games after 100% to set me apart from other YouTube reviewers, as well as lend myself some credibility. My Steam profile is public and linked in the description, and if you're curious what all a review after 100% entails, then I highly suggest you go to my channel, and if you're not subscribed, the first video you're going to see is a video explaining everything I cover, which is more than just the achievements, though the achievements are included. Now, that's especially noteworthy with UnderRail because the achievement list for UnderRail is very lacking in terms of the actual content of the game. The vast majority of the achievements for this are simply playing around with different builds and killing so many enemies a certain way. But jumping into the actual review here, UnderRail itself was first publicly available back in 2012 as a sort of early access period, and it was developed by one person actually, and then the game saw its full release in 2015 and is still actually being updated to this day. It got a DLC back in 2019 after the team had grown to 4 people, I believe, and got an update, a pretty substantial update, about 6 months ago from the time of this video. So the developers are quite committed to this game, frankly, and its very dedicated community. Now, that is actually important because the Expedition DLC added a great deal to the base game, as well as the DLC area itself, such as new weapons, new ways to get around, etc., and I'll talk more about that later. But that's an important thing to understand because it changed so much of the base game that my experience playing it in 2021 is going to be a bit different from people playing it back in 2015 when it released. But that said, the game itself is an isometric CRPG, kind of in the vein of Fallout 1 and 2. You can actually find multiple references to Fallout in the game. But to give some basic background and set up the story a little bit, this is a post-apocalyptic future in which most of society has been driven underground into the proverbial UnderRail. The surface of the planet has become uninhabitable. We aren't given the specifics, just that it can't sustain human life. You, as a character, start the game by joining a place called Southgate Station, which is one of the major settlements, if you will, of what is considered South UnderRail. And you're going to start your journey by doing missions and things for this station, which slowly progresses the story. Now, on the note of the story, I do think it is a very well-told story, and a lot of it comes together just amazingly, actually. However, it's a very slow burn. A lot of stuff doesn't get explained until almost the end of the game. And while I do think it's very well written, a lot of the plot points and the payoff for that story really doesn't come until like the last couple hours of the game. But that brings us to the difficulty section. So, UnderRail is a bit notorious for difficulty. I have some things to say about that, but I do want to reiterate that my experience in 2021 as someone who plays CRPGs and games for a living is going to be a bit different than someone just picking this game up back in 2015. That said, first things first, this game is built around save scumming. You're going to die constantly and you need to reload and save just all the time. But with that out of the way, we have 4 primary difficulties. That is easy, normal, hard, and dominating. Now again, as someone who does this for a living, I did not find normal difficulty very challenging. I got stuck twice. Once I will talk about a little later, and the second time was literally the last boss. There are a couple ways to beat that boss fairly easily. However, I had not built my character to do so, as I had went into this game blind, and I had to double back and solve a puzzle, which makes the fight easier. That said, I think for most people who don't play these type of games often, they might find normal pretty challenging, in which case you might want to go with easy. Now that said, while easy will remove some of the difficulty by occasionally removing some enemies, the primary difference between normal and easy, and honestly all of the difficulties, is centered around your health and healing items. So in easy, you actually have double the normal amount of health, with healing items healing double to compensate for that fact, as well as having the cooldown reduced on those items so you can use them more often in combat. Now, as you start going up in difficulty from normal, it does a couple other things as well, such as halving the value of your items, meaning that you sell things for less, which means you're harder up for cash on higher difficulties, as well as getting reduced health, etc. Now that's important because one of the things you'll hear about when it comes to UnderRail is your build and the viability of said build. In contrast to what most people would tell you, I think on normal difficulty, most builds are viable. You would almost have to be trying to deliberately make something kind of silly for your build on normal not to be viable. However, There is no respec or anything, meaning that if you make a bad build that doesn't work for you, then you have to just start a new game to fix it, which isn't everybody's cup of tea. But again, I'm of the opinion that most builds are viable on normal as long as you're not trying to do every brand of crafting on one character. But we'll get into character generation here in just a second, which naturally brings us to character creation. So when you're making a character in UnderRail, this is made up of your attributes, skills, feats, and later your specialization. Character creation, you're going to set your attributes. This isn't final, but it is a big deal, as attributes play an important part of the feats and things that are available to you, as well as your damage with various types of things, your chance to hit, etc. They are often required to use certain items, that type of thing. And setting up your attributes with a certain build in mind is very helpful and is basically mandatory for hard and dominating. And then that brings us to skills. Now, skills are actually pretty straightforward, especially if you've played the earlier Fallouts, as it is a numerical system you just put points into. Now, at the beginning of the game, you're going to have quite a bit of points, and at first level, you can put up to 15 points in any one of these skills, and you can spread your points around accordingly. And then every additional level will allow you to add 5 more to the cap for that skill. Now, it's important to pick a weapon or combat skill. Obviously, you need to be able to hit things. Defense comes down to dodge and evasion. This is your chance to counter the enemy's combat skill. We'll talk a bit more about that, but basically dodge is for melee and evasion helps you dodge ranged attacks. There's your subterfuge skills like hacking, lockpicking, pickpocketing, and stealth. Stealth can be amazing if you build for it. Hacking and lockpicking are incredibly useful throughout the entire game. Those two come up a lot. Pickpocketing I did not personally enjoy, and I didn't find it useful, frankly, though there are parts of the game where just pickpocketing an item can save you some time. Then there is Psi. Psi builds are really fun, and honestly, they're kind of top tier as far as builds go. Various psychic abilities come with all sorts of crowd control, as well as just controlling the battlefield, which is going to help you out a ton. However, giving yourself the ability to use Psi abilities will cost you 20% of your base health, though for most builds that's not a big deal. And on higher difficulties, things are just going to destroy you anyway in terms of health, so 20% doesn't make much of a difference. And again, considering all the crowd control you get from those abilities, they're very good. Crafting can be very good, but for a first playthrough, I'm not sure I would actually recommend crafting that much. Now, some of the best stuff you can get does come from the crafting skills. However, trying to max out all of them is a fool's errand. It's better to specialize, especially if you know what you want to craft, which requires some in-game knowledge, and as such, it's just hard to recommend a crafting discipline for someone just right out of the gate. Though once you play through the game, get more familiar with how the crafting system actually works, and understand the various things you can craft, maybe take some notes, I think crafting is more rewarding on a second playthrough, more so than the first. And then there is also the social skills. These are persuasion, intimidation, and mercantile. These can be situationally good. Personally, I didn't use them much, but they do have their place. They can kind of just help you out in certain situations to help you bypass fights, get better prices, just the normal stuff. But honestly, there's quite a bit of combat in this game, and I found it better to just prep for the fight rather than try to talk out of it. And then the last one that I want to mention skills-wise is traps specifically, because traps is just very good. This is your ability to detect and disarm traps. There are traps everywhere in this game, and just knowing where they are by being able to see them and then being able to disarm them is just incredibly useful, and it's going to save you a lot of headaches. And then just kind of a general note about skills is that they all have synergies, which is that some of them build off of each other, which then makes your effective skill slightly higher than your actual skill. And you can see these synergies as you mouse over each individual skill, and basically raising those other skills will increase your effective version of this skill by that much, which is the white number you'll see to the right of your skills. All of that said, we can talk about feats. Now, feats are where your build is actually going to take form, if you will. So your attributes and your skills are a bit broad. Now, attributes a little less so than skills, but as you saw with the combat skills, they're just like guns or melee, and that includes every type of those things. Guns includes everything from shotgun to sniper rifle. However, feats is where you're going to take a more specialized approach to things and get things that are specific to various weapon types or just more refined choices. Now, what feats are available to you is a combination of your attributes and your skills. Some of them don't have any requirements, but a lot of them do. and there are just tons of feats to choose from, and feats are really what define your build even more so than the actual skills. Now, at level 16, you're actually going to get access to specialization points. This was part of the Expedition DLC, but starting at level 16, you can specialize your feats. So every time you level up, you'll be able to spend a specialization point a certain number of times on the feats you've already chosen, which will increase their effect. So if there's a percentage modifier with that feat, specialization points will typically increase that further, or basically just make the positive of that feat even more positive. And then last but not least, every 4th level, you will actually get another attribute point to increase your attributes. However, starting at level 26, you instead get veteran feats instead of base attribute points. So these veteran feats are very strong things like increasing your base attributes by 2, or a few other things, and they're just very strong and they require you to be a very high level character to use. Now that brings us to the world building section. So the actual mechanics of the world is that you are navigating small connected maps, which then makes up lower and upper UnderRail, the cave systems, the Black Sea, which is the DLC area. But it kind of uses the connected map system that I saw in Baldur's Gate 1 actually. And I personally really like this. It makes it feel like a world, even though you're just kind of navigating these tiny maps from one place to another. Now the map itself is actually very large, and there are a few methods of fast travel that open up to you as you play the game, which is going to help you navigate this actually pretty substantially sized map. But you yourself start working for Southgate Station. You're going to work for them, do some tasks, kind of establish yourself with this new community that you've joined, and eventually you'll be sent to Core City, which connects upper and lower UnderRail. And that's important because Core City is, as you might imagine, the kind of core settlement for the area. A lot of factions vie for its control. In total, there's about 5 factions you can join in the game, 3 of which are part of the main story and kind of unavoidable. You will have to pick one, and then there's another one late game that you have to join as part of the main story, so don't really count that one here because you have to join that one, or at least kill all of them. But in the core city, in order to accomplish your main goal for going there, you have to ally with one of the 3 factions there, which is Cortec, JKK, or Praetorian Security. And this is noteworthy because each of these factions will give you unique quests while you are in Core City, which will result in you seeing parts of the city that are unique to that faction. You'll also be able to buy some unique gear from their vendors, which means if you don't make a save, but you probably will, there are potentially some things in Core City that you won't see on a single playthrough. Now, in addition to those 3 factions, we have the Protectorate and the Free Drones. The Protectorate are primarily a faction from up north, which we don't actually see in-game, but they are kind of the biggest main governing force, if you will, of the UnderRail, trying to bring civilization and order to everywhere. Now, the Protectorate is forced to deal with Core City because the only way into lower UnderRail is through Core City. However, the Protectorate have a bit of an imperialistic vibe to them, which puts them at odds with the Free Drones. The Free Drones are almost an anarchist movement that operates against the Protectorate. Depending on your actions and a couple quests, you can potentially join either of these factions, and both have their negatives, frankly. But those 2 actually aren't related to the main story, that's just some side stuff you can get involved in. And there's actually a great deal of other little settlements we can find around the UnderRail as well, such as Junkyard or Foundry. And how you interact and deal with all of these people will affect the end slides for the game, as well as potentially give you access to different kinds of equipment. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there is one faction you're kind of railroaded into joining as part of the main story called the Institute of Tchort, I believe it is. Probably butchering that. However, you don't even technically have to join them. If you just start attacking everyone, it will actually just advance that storyline, so you do have some options there. Technically, you don't have to engage with everyone, though trying to kill everyone in this game would just generally be a bad idea, and a lot more difficult than it's worth, but I do believe it is possible to do so. But I mention the Institute specifically because basically they believe there is some crazy perfect genetic being that is capable of solving all of the world's woes, and that they study it to manipulate the human genome to make things bigger and better, so to speak, for what's left of humanity. I mention them in particular because A, they're a faction, but also because if you talk to them, you can find out that one of their big goals, which I think is noble at least, is that they're trying to adapt humanity to potentially go live on the surface again, which is currently uninhabitable, but they feel that if they manipulate the genome enough, that living on the surface might become a possibility again, which I thought was just a bit of a neat hidden gem. And speaking of hidden stuff, there is so much hidden lore in this game. In fact, it's very easy to play through this entire game and just not pick up any of the actual lore, because it's not really shoved in your face at all. A lot of it is hidden. In fact, once you get to the latter parts of the game, a place called the Deep Caverns, you can find a lot of this lore and learn about the events that led to the creation of the last boss, or the primary antagonists, if you will. You can learn about the event called the Descent, which is when humanity descended into the underground caverns. You can learn about how the world was ruled by super corporations towards the end. There's even a quest line that if you perform it to a highly specific nature, you can find a sort of secret society that has been using almost alien technology to observe the world, which was left by people they refer to as the Godmen. I'd go more into that, but the idea of me telling you that is simply to pique curiosity and not to actually spoil anything. That said, for every bit of world building that this game does well, between all of the factions and their interactions, between all of the really cool settlements and how you can affect them by your playstyle, some of this is marred by very frustrating design, such as the save scumming being basically necessary, otherwise a simple mistake might cost you hours of progress. And then there is, in my opinion, probably the worst offender, which is the frustrating quest design. Some of these quests use quest design that I just have not seen in years, and it is annoying. To give a specific example, in Foundry you have to take a sample to a doctor, which is across the map. Like literally almost as far away as you could get. And then when you get to that doctor, he'll give you an answer and then be like, oh yeah, I also need this other sample from the exact place you literally just were. I'm like, yeah, technically your character doesn't know that you would have needed that, but good grief, what an annoying trek. And fast travel makes it a little easier, but just stuff like that where it's just frustrating because you're just making multiple trips back and forth places just to hear someone give you a bunch of non-voice acted exposition can be a little frustrating. But with no further ado, let's move on to the combat section. Now, combat is a turn-based action point system, which is very common of CRPGs like this. But a few key points are that you are usually going to be outnumbered. And focusing on crowd controlling your enemies can be incredibly helpful, either through incapacitating human enemies with things like a flashbang grenade, or robotic enemies with an EMP grenade. Basically, controlling the battlefield is the name of the game. Now, if you just absolutely cannot get past an area because of the combat encounter, you might want to start looking for other solutions, because it is very rare that the only solution is fighting everything. Sometimes you only need to fight some things. To give an example, the last boss, without spoiling anything, the last boss is very difficult because frankly, in my playthroughs, it tends to use the tactics I was using of just stun locking things on you. However, after struggling with this for a little while, I decided to investigate the puzzle in the previous room, which is when I found out that there was a puzzle that would actually weaken the last boss significantly, which made that fight much, much easier, and I beat it shortly after. But my point being is there's a lot of that in the game, actually. Some of it is more obvious than that puzzle by a long shot, but if you can't beat things by brute force, sometimes that's just easily done by sneaking somewhere instead through stealth, or just exploring other options for completing the quest, such as different routes, etc. Now, a couple other things on combat that I want to mention are wearing armor and the armor penalty versus dodge and evasion. So you will find armor, of course, as you play the game, and putting that armor on usually incurs an armor penalty. Now, what the armor penalty actually is a percentage penalty to your dodge and evasions. However, the trade-off there is that armor usually gives a flat percentage damage type reduction. So mechanical damage, heat damage, bio damage, etc. Armor will typically reduce those things by a flat percentage, whereas your evasion and dodge are a chance to just flat out negate the hit altogether. So how you built your character and playing around with those statistics can go a long way into just flat out just not getting hit in some cases, or reducing the damage so much that it's a non-factor to begin with. Now, probably a little ways into the game, you'll start picking up shields as well. Shields can potentially block all damage, at least temporarily in combat, which will help your survivability a great deal. However, they are required to be charged with various batteries, which has to be done manually. You'll find batteries throughout the game, you'll charge these, you'll charge your hacking devices actually for hacking locks and stuff, as well as some objects later, such as the jet skis. Now, this is normally where I talk about companions, however, there are no companions for this game, at least not permanent ones. You will get the occasional temporary companions that might join you on a specific mission or in a specific fight. And I did want to mention, do not use AoE abilities that will hit your friendlies, because there is not only friendly fire will actively turn your temporary companions against you, which can cause you a pretty big headache. And that brings us to the DLC, Expedition. Now, it's important to understand that the Expedition DLC added a lot of stuff. New weapon types, the jet skis that I just mentioned earlier, which will affect the base game by adding new areas and places for you to use that jet ski. Added approach to certain quests, allowing you to approach from the water on a jet ski. So the DLC does affect the base game quite a bit. However, the story itself, once you get to the core city, you're able to join an expedition on the docks to the Black Sea. The Black Sea is a mostly water-bound area where the expedition is looking for a specific item, and you'll help them find it. Now, while I did like the story of the DLC, and I thought it added a great deal to the lore, the ending was just very abrupt. Like, you're playing along, and then it's like you just, bam, there's the ending. And they're like, well, that's the end. And I was like, well, that was a little jarring, but okay. And the last thing I want to mention on the DLC, while I did like it quite a bit, I think, again, it's important to highlight the fact that this DLC and the refinements that have been made since 2015 colored my experience with this game, because the DLC affected the base game a great deal, added a lot of stuff. I believe the secret mutant ending that there was an achievement for, so I had to go through, was also added with the DLC, if I'm reading it correctly. By the way, there's a secret mutant ending if you happen to be turned into a mutant throughout your gameplay, which typically makes the entire world hostile to you. However, if you can get to the core city sewers, there might just be a way to still end the game. But my point is, all of that stuff affected my experience with this title, and I think that's noteworthy, especially with a game that has such a reputation for being very difficult, etc. So let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. Now, positives. It's an incredibly deep, great RPG. It has an amazing story to tell if you can actually get all the way through it. And the frustrating quest design, etc. doesn't put you off. The story itself is very well done. I liked it a lot. If you're a fan of Fallout 1 and 2, especially how those games worked mechanically, this game is probably going to be right up your alley. There are honestly a lot of things that coincide with how those games played out. Another positive is all the build variety. If you watch this channel at all and know how I play CRPGs, I do love a great complicated character system. And while I would argue this particular system is a bit simpler than some of the ones that I've used, I did enjoy some of the complexities of using the attributes to your advantage to get certain feats at certain times, etc. There's a lot of that, especially on the higher difficulties, and I personally enjoyed that. And another big positive is choice and consequence. There are factions that will keep you from seeing other content. There are factions to join, factions to find. There's all this lore and stuff about the world that you will actually only hear about, which I think adds to the world building quite a bit. And this game honestly does a lot of stuff very well. But that brings us to the negatives. So the biggest glaring problem for me in terms of negatives was just the quest design in some cases. It's just poorly done. There is the example I gave earlier. There's also another quest that a lot of people will probably know down in the comments, I'm sure, with a character whose name is Dude. This guy will lead you on a quest in an area that you can just get stuck at a level that you simply should not be here on, which can lead to you getting stuck for hours, which I think is just poor quest design because there's no warning, you're just suddenly stuck. And if you're not a high enough level, you're just stuck reloading. And things like that are going to frustrate people. Another negative is there's no voice acting and there is a lot of exposition. There is a lot to read, there's a lot to know, all that lore and everything that I was talking about earlier. All of that is done through text, and honestly it's like reading a small novel sometimes, because there is a lot of it. And while that doesn't bother me personally, I've been doing this long enough to know no voice acting is definitely a deal breaker for a lot of people. And then the other big negative for me is that the map is just so bad. So the map is not particularly intuitive. Apparently, there didn't used to be a map at all. Now, there's no quest markers, anything like that, which I'm fine with. However, if we're going off of directions, at least give me a decent map. But yeah, the map is just like these little squares, and as you move around, you'll find other squares connected, and I just didn't like the way this map worked, frankly. But to sum all of this up, kind of wrap this thing up, draw a conclusion here, ultimately, it's a great game for the price. The base game as well as the DLC, you're looking at like $25. On sale, you can get it for even less. There's easily 100 plus hours of content here. If you're a fan of CRPGs and you've played a lot of them, I couldn't recommend this more. However, that comes with the understanding that this game isn't trying to hold your hand. There's a lot of stuff they don't explain or they expect you to just figure out on your own. And because of that, it's just not for everybody. And while if you're just getting into CRPGs, I think you should keep this one in mind. I simply would not recommend this to beginners, but more so people more familiar with the genre. Because while I don't think somebody new to it couldn't possibly get through it or anything like that, a game like this, in my opinion, just isn't a great introduction into this type of video game, frankly. But if you're already familiar with games like this, then it can be a lot of fun. And if that sounds up your alley, then by all means, give it a shot. But there you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.